Having spent a great deal of my life as an official sitting through incredibly boring ministerial talks, I'm keen to try to make this a useful session for you by giving you some time to challenge, come up with ideas, object to the government and make suggestions rather than me gently churning out statistics at you, which is the other great tendency of ministers visiting conferences like this. But I just wanted to start with a couple of remarks as a way of opening up the conversation. And the first big question that I wanted to raise is the relationship between science and the environment. So I was very interested in the way in which people in the room thought about science and the environment. What do I mean by that? Well, clearly we are increasingly aware as the government how much we have to learn in the field of technology and data, how much that can help us, and how bad in many ways governments are in responding to this. On the other hand, we're very aware as governments how much we embarrass ourselves when it comes to technology and data. I was somebody who specialized in Afghanistan and Pakistan and conflicts in places like Iraq, and a lot of my world involved going to slightly grisly meetings in the United States where various men, maybe an aging senator or a general, would say to me sometime in the course of the conversation, well, of course, the solution to the problems in this country is, of course, twatter or something of this sort. They would, in other words, not have any idea what technology they were talking about. It's something their grandchildren used, but they had some idea in the back of their mind that somehow this thing would be transformatory. I had it again last night where I was sitting with a very distinguished ex-senior politician, cabinet minister, now in his early 80s, who kept earnestly looking at me across the table and saying, I believe that ISIS uses WhatsApp. Are you on WhatsApp? Right. Now, the reason I'm raising that is that I am quite keen for us as a government not simply to talk about data, technology, and science, but try to think seriously about where it helps us and where it doesn't help us. In some ways, data and science isn't the answer to everything. One of the problems, I'm trying to bring together at the moment a 25-year environment plan for the United Kingdom, which will lay out some of the basic fundamentals of where we go in Britain's environmental policy over the next 25 years. That's quite a necessary thing to do. It's a necessary thing to do because the government has, of course, enormous instruments at its disposal, even when it's short of cash. The regulatory environment, the laws we put in place, the protected areas in our landscape, about 25% of Britain at the moment is protected as national parks or areas of outstanding natural beauty. Our sites of special scientific interest, the Habitats Directive, all this stuff constrains what happens in Britain and will continue to constrain it over the next 25 years. We also have money. We've got European money, for example. It's going to spend about £3 billion through the Countryside Stewardship Scheme on delivering environmental benefits. We're also going to be channeling quite a lot of money into improving our water quality over the next 5 years. So this 25-year plan matters. But a lot of what we're doing in the environment isn't only to do with science and technology, and it's not even all to do with economics. A lot of it is to do with humans and human values and politics and society. This is a very crowded island. England is now more densely populated than India. We're trying to do a lot of very different things in Britain at the moment. Single valley that I was looking at up in northern Cumbria, Scottish border, that very same valley, people are simultaneously talking about mineral extraction. So there's a proposal for an open-cast coal mine. There's also a proposal for solar panels. There's a proposal for wind turbines. There's a suggestion from the Forestry Commission that it might be possible to roll commercial timber, Sitka spruce plantations south into the valley. The Woodland Trust has an area of native woodland. There's a SSI peatland, which Natural England has invested an enormous amount in trying to restore and which has brought it into conflict with a peat extraction facility. And then there are the farmers, small farmers trying to graze sheep, produce milk out of exactly the same ground which is being fought over by people trying to extract minerals, plant commercial forestry, plant native woodland, restore peatland, and create renewable energy. These things cannot only be resolved by a fancy computer system or by engineers sitting in a room. In the end, these are human landscapes. This country is our country. It's the public's country. And we have to find, if we're going to have anything sustainable in the environment, some way of connecting what we're doing to people's hearts, their souls, their ambitions, their sense, their landscape. To give another, perhaps more extreme example, we often imagine that our priority is simply to maximize the number of species in this country. So one way to maximize the number of species would be to follow, roughly speaking, what has been the American approach, which is to divide your land between areas of intensive agriculture, the Kansas, as you were, and areas of extreme wilderness, the Alaska, as it were. Now, in an island like Britain, that really isn't an option. That isn't really part of our history. And indeed, the British people, to some extent, want to have a generally greener landscape. They want to have generally greener agriculture. And they might be prepared at the margins to trade that for a policy which had intensive agriculture in some places and intensive rewilding in others, even if that latter approach maximized the number of species. Which brings me, just before I open up to you, to the questions of technology. So we are now exploring the ways in which technology can help us in the environment in a whole series of different ways. If you are a house builder and you're interested in the question of newts, we now have eDNA testing, which allows us to identify much more rapidly than we were ever able to before how many newts actually exist in a particular body of water. If you are in the forestry industry, we're now able to use drones in order to map undermanaged woodland. If you're looking at the farm payments or the land payments, which keep a lot of our environmental schemes going, we're now able to draw down on LiDAR data, which is light and radar data, which is owned by the Environment Agency and which maps to an incredibly high degree of resolution. That's very useful also in the way in which we think about marine things. If you are an environmental NGO, you can use social media of different sorts in order to engage citizen scientists. So there have been fantastic projects recently counting shark eggs, essentially sending out members of the public with their smartphones to document this. People talking about rhino protection in Africa are now talking about putting small cameras into the tusks of the rhinos in order to identify poachers. And more broadly than that, we're trying to run a natural capital model which is intended to make sure that we get the maximum bang for our buck. That all this money we spend on the environment up and down the country is really targeted to the areas that we need it most. There is a tendency, or there has been a tendency, to have a whole series of different things. So if we take water quality, traditionally some money was spent by the water companies, some money was spent by farmers who were then subsidized by the European Union in different ways to keep their stock away from riversides. Some money was spent directly by DEFRA going through the Eden River Trust, for example. That'd be an example of a voluntary body. More money is spent by the Highways Agency. And when you actually add all those figures up, it's a pretty stupendous sum of money. But because that money isn't generally coordinated, because we don't have a good way of targeting that money, it's probably the case that we're not getting the maximum benefit for the catchment from the expenditure that we're putting in. So again, that whole idea of natural capital accounting could be genuinely revolutionary. And there are a whole series of different groups, from water companies to local NGOs, coming to us saying we could spend that money much better if you gave us control of that money than you're able to do as a distant government doing it with a 300-mile screwdriver. All of this, then, is what I wanted to open up to you in our brief conversation, which is to say I would love to know from you where you yourselves are dealing with data and technology, what ideas you have, what thoughts you have on how you as businesses, as the private sector, can actually improve the British environment, what opportunities you think government is missing, what models we can learn from, and that is my purpose today. Thank you very much indeed.
So the challenge appears to be over to you. Any questions from the floor?
Or remarks. It doesn't have to be a
remarks,
question.
and,
It could be just a rude observation about the government. That's
I'll start. I'll use the chair's prerogative to ask the first one. Matthew surveyed EIC members about their hopes for the future and their concerns. One of the concerns that comes up, and you'll probably hear it from a lot of green groups as well, is this general perception or belief that the government isn't as committed to environmental issues and environmental challenges and tackling them as it could be, and it's not near the list of the government's sense of priority. So the question would be, is that concern justified? And I expect you to say no. How then can the government deal with that perception issue that many people in this sector feel that maybe there isn't the focus on it that there should be on issues such as decarbonisation, climate change, waste, etc.?
Okay, that's a good challenge. I guess that the first thing is to say that I'm not the minister who deals with decarbonisation. I'm not the guy that does climate change. I'm the person who does nature. I do natural resources. I do waste. I guess the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. I mean, what you will see over the next 6 years, I believe, is a very significant improvement in our water quality. You'll find that our rivers will be cleaner, and you'll be able to see that catchment by catchment, river basin by river basin. We will spend, I would estimate, about £3 billion on cleaning up our rivers over the next 6 years, quite a lot of money. You will see an improvement in our air quality. Again, I'm confident that by 2020 we will be in a situation where currently nearly 30 of our cities have more than 40 micrograms per cubic meter of nitrogen dioxide. We'll be in a situation where in even the worst cities, Leeds, Birmingham, Nottingham, Derby, Southampton, we will be below 40 micrograms per cubic meter. We'll have the cleanest air that we've ever had in Britain. So I guess you will also be able to track me on how much woodland we're going to have in place, how much peatland we're going to have in place. I'm confident there will be more trees by the end of my period in office than there were before I came in. There'll be more restored peatland than there was before I came in. And you should be able to also track that through individual habitats, and if we're lucky, although there are issues that are quite difficult to deal with there, through individual species. So I guess I'd like to get us out of a conversation about the government doesn't care about the environment towards a conversation about the fact that we will be spending a pretty eye-watering sum of money on improving the environment. There is a question, I guess, within this room of how much taxpayers' money, how much ratepayers' money you want to spend on the environment, how much the public wants to spend on the environment. We may not spend as much as some people in this room would like, but we're certainly spending a great deal more than governments traditionally spent on this kind of activity. And I think you'll see the result. We'll have cleaner water, we'll have cleaner air, we'll have cleaner soil, and we'll have more forestation.
The one area you didn't mention there was waste, and it's very much an area that plays into this kind of technology revolution that you want to tap into, and more data and the like. This time last year, I think the previous government's waste strategy was widely criticised as not being as ambitious as it could be. Do you see that as an area where you can push forward more ambition and ensure that we hit our recycling targets and start to deliver a more circular economy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a number of aspects to waste, but for me, the one that I'm focused on most at the moment is the craziness of the fact that we have over 300 different recycling systems in Britain, household recycling systems. Almost every council is running a different recycling system. So we really need to find a way of coordinating that. Now, that's a difficult thing for a government to do because local councils, quite understandably, feel this is their prerogative. In fact, for some councils, it's a real issue of pride. The only thing they actually have their council logo on is their bin. And that is their most visible presence for some people they feel in the streets. But obviously, it makes sense for the nation, it makes sense for ratepayers, it makes sense for natural resources, if we can get down from 300 odd systems to, let's say, 5 or 6. It should be possible to have those standardized systems. I believe if we can get towards them, we've got to do it on a voluntary basis. I've got to convince the councils of this. We can save the council's money, save the ratepayers' money, and we can drive up our recycling rates quite dramatically because there'll be extraordinary economies of scale available to the recycling industry to be able to have a standardized system. And in particular, in separation of paper and glass, there seem to be real commercial opportunities for the councils, which we aren't currently exploiting. So I think that would be my answer on waste.
The recent consultational draft air quality plans, I think, show the government has, at the same time, failed in making use of technology to address the air pollution challenge that that the UK faces. But I think there's an EIC report on the need to make more use of a mix of technologies to drive down emissions. But also there's a failure on relying too much on technology to save the day, with the idea that things like clean technology with the Euro standards failing to actually address reductions of emissions in the real world driving emissions, and the fact that we know that the many national governments at the EU have been negotiating to weaken the Euro standards and deliver a lot less of a reduction than should be needed.
Interested if you're comfortable talking about it, what you meant by the first thing. What are these technological solutions? I mean, essentially, as you're aware, the central problem we're dealing with is a problem of different compounds of nitrogen. Fundamentally, the source emissions of those in our cities are non-road mobile machinery, construction machinery, boilers, buses, taxis, heavy goods vehicles, light goods vehicles, and private cars. Now, this is a government that is really, really keen to back electric cars. We would like many more people driving electric cars. We believe the future is electric cars. I'm absolutely certain that by 2050, everybody will be driving an electric car. It makes sense for Britain to try to get ahead of that. It would solve a lot of our problems in terms of nitrogen dioxide, even particulate matter. But I'd be interested to know what you actually would propose that a government does to accelerate that take-up. And what is the industrial strategy you're proposing?
Well, it would be very hard for me to do that because I'm not a technical professional, but I would say that there's a lot of issues around promoting electric vehicles. There was discussions at the recent IAQM conference about what the capacity is really with electricity production, generation and distribution in order to be able to heavily promote electric vehicles.
On that, I would say, to be honest, from my point of view, that's a problem I'd like to have. I mean, I wish the problem was that we had so many electric cars we were blowing our grid apart. That's a classic sort of engineers.
There are companies in London already who are having that problem and are not able to expand because there aren't substations to do this.
It is, though, I promise you, basically a problem I would really, really like to have. I mean, that seems to me that's us worrying about something basically down the road. At the moment, we need to get more people driving electric cars. If we ended up with so many people driving electric cars, we were blowing the grid, I'd be really, really happy about that situation. But we're not close to that.
I'm just going to bring in Matthew Farrar, because I think there was a report only last week on air pollution from EIC along these very lines.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I think the question was probably referring to this. So we did a report. Our view is, you're absolutely right, electric vehicles are clearly the medium-term solution, and we want to see quicker take-up of those. But the air quality problem is so challenging in the short term, we've got to use other technologies as transition technologies where we can do that. And the report we did modelled a number of options, retrofit, more bus retrofit outside London, alternative fuels, LPG, renewable diesel for NRMM, retrofitting more NRMM, so construction site machinery, LPG is an option. And the report broadly says there's no single answer. In the long term, electric vehicles may well be the single answer, but in the short term, there's a cluster of technologies, photocatalytic treatments as well, which are available, many of which are developed by people in this room, and which we think the government needs to be bringing into play as quickly as it can, just to try and bring down NO2 levels, PM levels, as quickly as we can, while we wait for the electric vehicle revolution to materialise.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think there's no disagreement from us on any of that. I mean, in effect, the only way we're going to get into compliance is by doing many of those things. And if you look at our plans, which are out in consultation at the moment, an enormous amount of that is exactly about those kind of retrofit solutions. And specifically about Nottingham, Leeds, Derby, Birmingham, Southampton, trying to look at whether we can actually simply set up clean air zones in order to ensure that buses and taxis are retrofitted, HGVs are retrofitted, and in one city, light goods vehicles are retrofitted. So I don't think there's much disagreement about that. I think the question from a public policy point of view, again, and this goes back to the discussion I was having on natural capital, which is how much public money do you want to put into that, and where do you want to put it? So, I can set up a low emission zone, and I can instruct everybody who goes into that low emission zone, in theory, that they simply have to retrofit their vehicle. The question then is, to what extent does the government provide assistance to people retrofitting their vehicles? What are the impacts on the businesses of retrofitting those vehicles? How much does the retrofitting cost? How does retrofitting a non-road mobile machine, piece of non-road mobile machinery weigh up against the cost of retrofitting buses? Yeah, well, that's exactly where we are. I mean, I don't think there's much gap, unless I'm missing something, between your report and what's actually gone out in our consultation. But if you think there is, I mean, by all means come forward, because we're closing our final plans for air quality at the end of this year. So this is really the moment at which to speak.
I'm Nigel Paul from Lancaster University. I actually work in a faculty of science and technology, so it's great to hear you highlighting the key role of those as we think about the environment. But actually, when you talk about science and technology, you talk about eDNA, you talk about LiDAR, you really talk about ways of monitoring the environment. It strikes me, especially as we think about the following session on innovation, that the environmental industries need a far wider range of science and technology that will contribute to delivering solutions in the environment than just monitoring. So I wonder if you could explore the wider vision of science and technology as it relates to environment.
Well, that seems very exciting, but I suppose I'm going to throw that back and say, can you give me some examples of?
Well, I think actually for me, we work with industries across a whole range of environmental sectors, but that's physicists, chemists, computer scientists, engineers,
but perhaps,
as well as traditional environmental scientists.
But I mean, I'd love to include, we're, as I say, doing this 25-year environment plan at the moment. It would be wonderful if we could get some case studies in. You're right, we're focusing a lot on monitoring.
I mean, it'd be really interesting to hear from this audience what sort of science and technology the industry really needs.
Good. Well, can we use our last 5 minutes to do that? Can we challenge the audience to come forward with some ideas? That's sort of what I was hoping for.
Exciting technologies. A chance for a sales pitch to the Minister. I promised the lady there in the black jacket the next question. You had your hand up, madam. Yep, just there. I promised you the next question. But yeah, let's kick that sales pitch around. Go on. Sorry.
Hi there. Christina Holgrave from Skanska UK Construction. You briefly mentioned natural capital accounting, which is something we've started to look at within our business between our finance team. I just wanted to ask if there are any opportunities for working with government and businesses kind of on this topic and kind of collaborating and sharing ideas, because it's quite kind of a new area that could really change the way we kind of think and make strategic decisions.
We'd love to include you. We've got a man called Dieter Helm, who's been the chair, and I'm hoping he's going to take over again as the chair. And we have somebody called Nick Barter in my office, who's the director responsible for natural capital. Love to put you in touch with them. It'd be great to get your insight. Can I just say once more, I'm looking for technology ideas from this room, and I'm not getting them. Go on, please, sir. Yeah.
27 years ago, we introduced into the UK, in fact the wider world, a method of treating water using electronics, no chemicals. It dealt with hard water. Hard water is responsible for all sorts of problems, including increased energy, increased water, risk of Legionella, increased maintenance, all these issues. The barrier to getting that technology accepted is there is no test and there is no standard. I've just spent 3 years now doing an environmental technology verification program with the WRC, where we've done a test on a Victorian swim bath in Swindon, and the results of that test is a saving in gas of 18,000 a year. That's 17%.
Great.
I'm now talking to the Energy Savings Trust, who still put the barrier up. There is no test. That test isn't scientific enough to be acceptable, and yet all the evidence we've had over the years, my last MP wrote to DEC and got it was a previous government, so no, it's well accepted how to deal with hard water, just use chemicals. Well, these barriers need to come down.
This would be great. Could you possibly please get an email to Ian Boyd, who's our chief scientist, say that you've spoken to me, and we'll try to take up this question. I agree. One useful thing a government can do is provide standards.
I introduced this to the Director of Sustainability, the Building Research Establishment, at a conference, and he said, your gadget doesn't work. So I sent him some evidence, and he ignored it.
Good. Ian Boyd.
Thank you.
Lady behind. Yeah.
Thank you. Miranda Barker from Allen Environmental. We work in partnership with Lancaster as well, actually, on the development of new environmental technologies, one of which Lancaster are working on now is the river power pod, which is microhydro, which doesn't involve any water diversion. It's good within any of the water authorities, but also in any of the high energy users to stop the maximum drawdown from the grid. But the problem we have with environmental technology development in the UK is there isn't any funding for the stage when you've done the prototype, you've got it done in the lab, you've got customers who are really interested to see it, but there is no funding to put a demonstrator on a site so the customer can literally come and see it. And we're scraping funding together left, right and centre to try and take demonstrators to China and to Brazil. But the hardest place to do one is in the UK.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let's take a final one from somebody. Gentleman there.
Minister, you'll know that Thames Water are spending £4 billion on the super sewer or more. And yet there are alternative technologies, SUDS, real-time management of the system, which would achieve the same with a much lower price. It doesn't make common sense. Other places such as Cardiff, Italy, have introduced SUD systems at much lower cost than other ventures. Is that not an occasion to actually promote that kind of scheme?
Martin, we've talked about this subject a great deal. That wasn't a new technology idea to me, Martin, to be fair. But right, let's go to the gentleman behind.
Good morning. Paul Oxford from Autogas Limited. Just following up on a couple of previous questions. First of all, we'd like to thank the Minister and his department for his recent engagement with the LP gas industry as part of the consultation, and also his parliamentary response as to how LPG can help improve urban and local air quality. However, would he be prepared to look into the possibility of undertaking a more formal assessment of LPG and other alternative fuels in improving urban and local air quality?
Okay, thank you. All right, let me sort of wrap up here because I'm now overrunning into your next session. What I would very much like to do is maybe see if EIC were interested, or if not EIC, somebody else, in trying to corral together a group of 10 to 12 technological ideas, which could be really exciting in my bit. Right, so my bit is not the carbon capture, climate change bit. It's the other bit. It's the water, air, soil, nature bit, which we can really challenge our chief scientists with, and which we can challenge ourselves with. Exactly questions like whether we have the right tests in place, whether we are supporting demonstrators in the right way, what we can do to tie you into other bits of government that do have funding for these sort of things. But it would be really exciting for us to have science and technology ideas corralled and have a group that can challenge us on a dozen of the best ideas coming out of Britain. So I don't know whether that's something EIC would like to take forward, but that's something I'd be very interested in. So EIC very kindly is volunteering to do that. That is wonderful, in which case I make an offer that if EIC will bring this forward and get a dozen people in the room, I'd love to sit down with those people in my office and have a more detailed discussion about some of these technologies. So thank you all very, very much indeed, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.